Denmark is about to deport more than 1,000 Syrian refugees who came to Denmark over the last years. The Danish government is basing the decision on a report saying that Damascus in Syria is now safe to return to again. But the Danish government has no diplomatic relations with Bashar Al Assad's government in Syria, so the people sent back to Syria will most likely be kept in detention centers, and those are not pleasant. People against this decision are saying that Syrian men sent back to Syria are almost certain to face jail time for evading military duty. So recognizing this, Denmark will mostly be sending women back to Syria, so the whole debate about family separation has begun all over again. Alright guys, so this is a complicated one. This whole mess began because the Danish government has a new report out saying that Damascus in Syria is now safe. So the Danish government has begun not renewing residence permits for all of these Syrians, right? What's interesting about this issue is that almost all of the political parties in Denmark are behind this decision. So it's not controversial in terms of the law, but it's controversial on like a human level. Denmark has no diplomatic ties with the government of Syria right now. So if we send these Syrians back once they land in Syria, we can no longer guarantee their safety. They are under the full responsibility of the Syrian government. Because of that, Denmark has decided to not send home anyone who's in danger of going directly to jail for evading military duty. But that means military-aged men, and that means that this law is hitting female Syrians in Denmark almost exclusively. And it's not like the Syrian women will just get off the hook. Once they arrive in Syria, they will most likely be put in detention centers until the Syrian authorities can find out who they really are. Since no one really expects the government of Syria to move with the speed of light on this issue, it could mean that these Syrian women would be held up in detention centers for a long time. And effectively, that means that we'll be stuck with a lot of men in military-aged men in Denmark that no longer have their families to help them out. One of the people affected by this law is Gali, who's a 27-year-old girl who was reunited with her family in Denmark when she came in 2015. She had this to say about it. I feel nothing but fear about going into the immigration center by myself, but I can't return to Syria. It's like they believe that we have a choice, but if I go back, I will be arrested. You can't do anything in the immigration centers. You can't work, you can't study. It's like a prison. I'll just waste my life away in there. So because of all of this, lawyers representing these refugees or immigrants by now are trying to sue the Danish government in the European Court of Human Rights. The European Court of Human Rights, or the ECHR, is heavily influenced by the EU. So you can imagine that there'll be a lot of pushback in terms of this issue, because the leading members of the EU were the ones who was pushing for the refugees from Syria to come into Europe in the first place back in 2015 until 18. I tried looking into it, but I actually couldn't find any other countries that now deem Damascus safe. Like the UN is heavily condemning all of this, and I couldn't find any like single countries who deem Damascus safe at this point. And the reason this case is really interesting and important for the rest of Europe is that Europe is so divided on the issue of immigration. Like, if Denmark gets away with sending all of these refugees back to Syria, it sets a precedence for the other countries. It's going to be like a very welcomed precedence for some countries, but other countries like France and Germany will see it as a huge defeat for the whole process of taking in this many migrants and refugees from Syria in the first place. In the beginning of this refugee crisis from Syria, France and Germany were heavily invested in trying to convince all of the other nations that Syrian refugees could easily be integrated into European societies. And so whether they could or couldn't, that's not really the issue. It's considered a big defeat if that idea is rejected within the EU, because then in a lot of ways France and Germany will lose face, at least in terms of their initial plan to convince Europe that this was a good idea. It's interesting because The Guardian was reporting that Denmark has like 35,000 people from Syria living in Denmark right now. And it also says that in recent years, however, the Scandinavian country's reputation for tolerance and openness has been affected by the rise of the far-right Danish People's Party. They then seem to realize that this is like supported by almost all of the political parties, not just so-called far-right parties, right? So they say that it's also an attempt by the center-left coalition in government to win back votes. It's funny because it's both like a far-right conspiracy, but it's also the center-left just trying to win back votes. It's such a weird way for the news to look at these issues, but I just see it as like it's got broad support with the people, and that's why all of the political parties are supporting it. The news just love to portray anything they consider anti-immigration as far right because it makes it easier to dismiss. While, by the way, while BLM riots and stuff is considered center left, that seems legit, right? So I should say that this decision is meeting some kind of opposition inside of Denmark. They are having protests in places like Copenhagen, actually mostly Copenhagen, and it seems to also mostly be Syrians who are protesting it, or people who are very close to Syrians as well. I was reading interviews from these Syrians protesting, and they are convinced that being sent back is really bad news. So this is where it's the most complicated for me, like on a human level, because thousands of Syrian families will be affected by this, and we're talking about people who are well integrated into Denmark. And obviously you're gonna have both like groups. You're gonna have people who are well integrated and people who are not well integrated. But you can only have sympathy for these families who have to send, like, let's say 1 or 2 of the women in their families back to Syria, and they know that they are going to be facing these detention centers. At that point, you can only have sympathy for these people. If you've seen any of my other videos, you probably know that I'm heavily in favor of enforcing immigration laws, and that is what this is. But this is also a mess, no matter what we do, and I think first and foremost, we need to keep people safe. As I told you, this decision is meeting heavy international opposition, so it'll be interesting to see where the case actually lands in a couple of weeks. I'll make sure to update you guys when it happens. Tell me what you think about this issue down below, and if you feel generous, hit me with a like for this video as well. See you guys in the next one.